Hello, and welcome to IEP Essentials Pro Tips Podcast, brought to you by Learning Essentials. Learning Essentials offers special education-based tutoring in your home by state-certified educators with advanced degrees in all areas of special education. IEP Essentials Pro Tips Podcast brings professionals together to educate and empower families navigating special education needs in the IEP process.
Catherine Whitcher is the founder of Master IEP Coach and Mentorship Plus Network, leading hundreds of parents and teachers every day to build meaningful IEPs that prepare children for further education, employment, and independent living. As a certified special education teacher, special needs sibling, IEP consultant, and over 25 years of experience, Catherine brings you new perspectives of the many sides of the IEP table. She loves to show everyone at the IEP table how to simplify and collaborate at a whole new level that always keeps the child first. Welcome so much to IEP Pro Tips Podcast. I'm Wendy Taylor. I am your host, and I'm very excited to chat with Catherine today because Catherine, I always say it shouldn't be this hard. And so I'm excited to hear the insights that you're going to share with us to really help the whole entire IEP team come together collaboratively and kind of reduce the stress that folks experience on both sides of the table, professionally and personally, when they're at an IEP table. So good morning, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to help everybody at the IEP table make just things easier and make a difference and create meaningful IEPs that are really going to have both a short-term and a long-term impact.
Exactly. And that is really, I heard that, I really look at it this way in terms of when you create an IEP, you really want from 1 year from the date of that IEP to reconvene and celebrate the progress. And so it is, but also keeping that lens in mind that you are raising a human that needs to go out in life, that needs to be successful in any path that they choose. And so really kind of looking at that small picture of what are we looking and how are we going to support this student? And then this big picture of this person is going to go out into the world and need skills so that they can interact and be productive. And so what instance made you realize that the IEP process needs more readjustments, or that it wasn't, how did you realize that you could make things different?
Well, so you mentioned I'm a special needs sibling. So my brother is 43 with Down syndrome, which means that I grew up in a special needs household watching my family go through the special education system. And then I became a special education teacher. And I can remember walking into my classroom, which by the way was empty as a brand new teacher, completely empty, with a milk crate filled with papers, and that was my students' IEPs. And I can remember flipping through them thinking like, okay, what materials do I need? And how do I get all these things in my classroom? And how do I really implement their goals? And how do I make this happen? And I can specifically remember thinking, all right, I'm going to look and see, what do the parents want? Because being a special needs sibling, we all know, like, if mom's happy, like, more people can be happy. We all can be happy. And, if the parents are on board with what's going on, it's going to be a little bit more smooth sailing. And I had this blank canvas. I'm brand new and a whole lot of paperwork. So I would go to the parents and I would say, like, what are you struggling with at home? And they would say something like, I can't even get dinner on the table because my child needs my attention 100% of the time. And I was like, oh, so we're going to work on independent work in the classroom. Like, I'm going to help your child get the skill to get focused, to have independent work. And then you can generalize that at home so they can do some independent work. So you can like cook the macaroni and cheese. Like, we weren't talking a gourmet dinner. We're talking about like, can we boil some water without getting an interruption? And that was really the start of, I'm going to teach by day, and then I'm going to start coaching parents and teachers by night on how to bring all of this together. And that creates a meaningful IEP goal. Something as simple as we're going to work on independent work, which gives independence in the school. And then that's going to translate to home. And then long-term, We all want our children to be as independent as possible in their job at home. So that when I'm talking about short-term and long-term, I'm talking about these higher level skills that we forget about because they seem so simple. But it really came from a moment of desperation of like, how am I going to make all these IEPs work as a teacher so I can do my job and we can collaborate and stay out of conflict. I knew that was one of my goals as a special ed teacher.
Well, and I think it's amazing that you really reached out, that bridging that gap to the parents, which does sound simple. And I know over time, just personally conducting IEPs and sitting in on many IEPs, I really appreciate the folks that take a pause and ask the parents before you even get started, do you have any questions? Do you want to ask me anything? What are your concerns? Because I think that automatically levels that playing field, that it reduces that anxiety for the parents that are sitting, you walk into an IEP meeting as a parent and it's like a board meeting and you have a lot of folks, a lot of players, which is great, because they're there to support your kiddo, but it is also very anxiety producing for parents. It's a language that they're not familiar with, a lot of acronyms, and at the end of the day, it's your baby. So for a educator to reach out to the parent and kind of bridge that gap and to say, hey, what are your biggest concerns? What are you seeing at home? And then say, oh, well, we can do this. This is easy. We can build these skills, build this capacity so that you can then have a moment to boil some water at home. And that, I think, as any parent would incredibly appreciate to have and to be a part of. So when you first did your IEP with your milk crate of stuff, did you feel prepared as an educator?
Absolutely not. And that's one of the reasons when, somebody looks at, any of the programs that I run, whether I'm on stage speaking or it's the Master IEP Coach mentorship or it's, a small community group, wherever it is, I always say, if you sit at the IEP table, you are welcome. So I want parents and teachers and admins and therapists to gather in the same room. We are expected to work together, but we're all coming with a different perspective and a different amount of knowledge. And it is assumed that if you go to school, now mind you, I didn't just get a bachelor's degree. I have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, 5 teaching certificates in Illinois, all in different special ed. They do it a little different nowadays, but back then they broke everything up into, 5 different categories. I had to take all these tests. I have all these things. And I'm a special needs sibling, which means I have sat at IEP tables. So I had some of the personal experience and I still had no idea what some of that paperwork was that was flying around the table. Now, parents think often that they're the only ones who don't know what every piece of paper is that's getting shuffled around. Like nowadays we're doing them by Zoom. So they get these attachments that are, 15 pages long from each provider. And they think like, oh my gosh, if I really ask about every one of these, I'm either not going to look like I'm intelligent and I should know these things, especially if their child's like, let's say 12. They're like, I've been doing this for so long. I should know these things. Or if you're a teacher, you don't necessarily bring up to your boss that you don't know what some of the paperwork is, because then you feel at risk of getting fired or punished or, replaced. So it's like this unspoken, and I'm the first one to be like, listen, there's no way that as a teacher, you know what all the speech therapy paperwork is. There's no way as a parent that you know what all the psychological testing means. There's no way that all of us have exactly the common language because we all have a different level of expertise. So let's use our expertise. I know my stuff. I know my part of the IEP really good. And my goal as a teacher was to make sure that the parent knew every piece. And that didn't mean that I needed to know all of it. That just meant as a teacher, even when I was sitting at that table, paid for by the district, I would look to the parent and say, do you understand what she's saying? When that speech therapist was going over all of the different articulation goals and what's happening. I'm like, she's talking about muscles of the mouth and all these different things. And it's mind blowing when you're sitting there. So absolutely did not feel prepared for the whole process, was not prepared for the things that maybe my name was going on it because it was part of the document. And I definitely could see how parents were prepared as best as possible, most parents who are shown at the table are prepared as best as possible, but they didn't always know the right questions to ask because you don't know what you don't know.
I say that often. I say that often. So how has your process changed in terms of preparing for your first IEP versus now? And I know, part of what you do is coach people on how to prepare. So what is the difference between your first one to now that really has helped change the reality of this experience?
Well, I can give a specific example when you said, it was great that I reached out and I said to the parent, what do you want? What are you working on? What's frustrating you? And really, I was looking for clarification for myself again, so I could do my job. That process evolved into really focusing on a parent input statement for every family that works with me right now. So I'm not in the classroom now. I've been, for the last 2 decades, I've been outside of the classroom helping this process along in a lot of different capacities, but I will always go back to what is in the IEP from the parent's perspective. And it goes beyond just asking, what are your concerns? Because quite honestly, the parents are like, well, I'm concerned that I can't get into the medical specialist a month from now. And I'm concerned that I can't get dinner on the table. And I'm concerned because I don't know if they're ever going to have a typical relationship with their sibling. And I'm like, what concern do you want? kind of thing. So teaching a team to really guide a parent into creating a parent input statement, which is valid in all states. This information I'm giving you is valid for all states. This is where I say, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to tell you where to look in a lot of different places of why this is a valid process. This isn't wishful thinking that parents would get this input. This is actually part of the IEP process. And I help parents and teachers come together and create this parent input statement that covers social concerns, emotional concerns, behavioral concerns, communication concerns, and academic concerns. That's what the school can help with. The school can help with all of those things. They can't help with the complex medical issues. They can't necessarily help with the sibling, issues. And a lot of times as parents, there's a hard differentiation between like, what can the school do and what should I be focusing on? And how do I bring all this to the table? So that process that started very informal in the beginning of my career has become a very formal part of every training that I do, because that is the guide. The bottom line is the parent is the only one who's going to be at every IEP meeting for that child for their entire school career. And the parent's going to be guiding that child or taking care of them for the rest of their life. So we have to get on board for what those long-term outcomes are from a parent perspective. And for the IEP team, it's a huge relief to have some guidance of like, okay, so this child has a deficit in reading. And the teacher's like, in her teacher brain, she's thinking, I've got 99 things I could work on to help this child with reading. How do I pick which ones? But if you take your teacher expertise and then you take the parent expertise and you overlap them, you find this sweet spot on how to find goals that have a long-term impact.
How do you encourage the parents to grow in that area in terms of developing that statement? And the reason I'm asking is I've had parents, they'll send out prior to an IEP, a parent, what is your parent input? And it's this kind of worksheet format of, going through everything you just said. And that parent that's really just trying to, again, back to the analogy of just boiling water and kind of juggle all this. And if there's more than one sibling in the house and they're working and multiple experiences and things going into that, how do you get them to kind of help flush out that statement and articulate it in a way that they're heard?
So there's 2 strategies. One is stop trying to do it alone. I mean, whether you come find me over at the Special Education Inner Circle or you find somebody else, stop trying to figure it out. You have to get out of your own head because you're in the trenches in all those different areas that we talked about that are not relevant to school, and it clouds your communication in being able to really clarify what the school can do. So stop trying to do it by yourself. You're going to have to produce this by working with somebody else or bouncing it off your neighbor. And, let's just face it, sometimes, your spouse doesn't want to hear about it anymore. That's hard. I mean, that's a hard thing in a special needs family, is there's so much communication around medical needs, educational needs, all of those things, that the communication at home gets burnt out. So having a third party person, whoever that is, help you construct and communicate a message that really guides education is key. The second thing is, a lot of times parents try to do this in either a very informal way or in a very angry way. There's kind of like two sides of it. So either it's like, hey, I was thinking that maybe next year we could kind of sort of work on, and it's this email that it's like, oh, well, thanks, Mom, for that idea. That's good. We'll consider it. We don't want that. So when parents say, I'm not being heard, it's most likely because they're communicating often and they're trying, but it's not in a direct communication, almost business style. We've got something that needs to get done business style. Then we have angry tones. It's, according to the law, you must provide my child with a free and appropriate public education, and therefore you will, and then you become the dictator of what's going to happen. And there's this in-between format that's more formal than, teacher sending home an inquiry letter. It's more formal than the casual emails, but it's not angry. And that's just a parent advocacy letter format that I've been using for a really long time. In fact, quite honestly, I'll kind of tell you guys a secret. So I was teaching by day, and I was writing these letters for my students' parents while I was teaching. And then I was like, listen, I'm going to write this letter and I'm going to give it to you, and you're going to sign it and you're going to send it to my boss. And when my boss says, oh my gosh, did you know this? I'd be like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And it was just one of those things where, and there's a lot of this for anybody who's like, oh my gosh, she was being a corrupted teacher. No, there's a lot of, we all know there's the wink, wink, nudge, nudge teachers that will tell you things. And I was that teacher. And you know what? My boss knew, everybody knew. It's how we worked the system, because a parent doing a more formal piece of communication that is clearly based in the foundation of ideal law, without anger, without being passive aggressive, being extremely direct, and not saying kind of, sort of, maybe I want this, but this is what my child needs so they can be prepared for further education, employment, independent living. And I didn't make those categories up. That's in the law too. So it's that in between. So you don't do it alone. And then you get the formatting of the communication correct. And then it really starts to guide the process.
100%. And I really appreciate that point of finding a third party. And it doesn't have to, it could be your neighbor, it could be your bestie, it could be, somebody like yourself, a coach, a mentor, but somebody that can be a part of the conversation, that can really take that emotional component out of it, because we often as parents, come from a place of fear and love. And sometimes when we articulate that, it comes across, like you said, angry or uncertain. And so to have somebody bounce those ideas to help you kind of create this, what you want to say in a clear fashion is then received and very collaborative. It has to be, that team has to be collaborative for sure. So what else? So we talked about the parent input statement. We talked about kind of trying to remove some of the emotion from it so that you're clear as a parent in terms of communicating your concerns. In your opinion, what are some other factors that complicate the IEP process that we could easily remedy just by having this conversation and having parents and even professionals listen to us?
So one of the biggest things is to make sure that you are extremely clear about what you're doing in your role of the IEP. So I'll give a very concrete example. I'm kind of yelling this from the rooftops right now, considering everything that has happened in the past year of education. This has been an issue ongoing for the last, 45 years that the law has been enacted, but there's been a magnifying glass put on a lot of things. And with that, there's an example of accommodations and modifications. Almost every IEP has a list of accommodations and modifications. I want to know who's doing them, who's responsible for them, how often are they getting done, how often is a child even using them. A lot of times there's this big page of accommodations and modifications, and the child doesn't even need half of them because they were created in 3rd grade and now they're in 6th grade and nobody updated that page effectively. And when you really clarify what's happening with accommodations and modifications, because that's the glue. You have all the pieces that are happening. You got to learn this goal and the schedule looks like this, and you have to go to this service, and then you have to, you have all these different things, moving parts. But if these supports and services on the little things aren't being done, other things fall apart. So these accommodations and modifications, it's the first place that I look, because most of the time I get the really stressed out parents that are like, nothing's going right in my child's education. What do I do next? And I say something like, well, my child's not making reading progress. And I'll say, okay, well, are they getting their instruction in a small group and a quiet space? And the parent's like, I have no idea. And I'm like, well, it's listed in the IEP that they're supposed to get this in a small group. And the parent's like, I didn't know that they were even supposed to be doing that. So when you bring it up to the teacher, it's not an accusation. It's, is this happening? Yes or no? If the answer is no, let's make it happen, because we may not need to change anything in the IEP. We may just need accountability for what's in there. If it is happening, then okay, then it's not working. How often is it happening? Is this, we can kind of pick that apart a little bit. But this communication over the finer details, it also eliminates, and this is a huge thing that's happening right now. Again, always has, but it's even more. It's child can do something at school, but they can't do it at home, or vice versa. They're doing something at home and they can't do it at school. And the difference is, how is it being presented? How's the child being prompted? What materials are being used? What's the environment like? And it's absolutely a skill to be able to generalize something between multiple environments. So we cannot assume that the school is lying, the child's not doing this, or that the parent's lying, they're really not doing this. It's how is it being done? So again, those are just a couple of examples of what makes the process easier is when you ask more questions and you look at the details.
Is there an aspect of the IEP process that you see parents stress unnecessarily about? That's a huge question.
Yes, so there's so many
the whole time.
Everybody's like, okay, which one do we pick with this? So I'm gonna go with this, because this is what calms down parents when I talk to them. They need to remember that an IEP meeting is one meeting. That's all that it is. It is a living document that can be changed at any time. It's a process sometimes to change it in a difficult way. Sometimes it's easy. But the bottom line is, there's this big kind of event around this IEP meeting, like it's a do or die situation, and my child's future 20 years depends on this one meeting, because if I don't get this IEP goal right, my child is going to never learn how to count.
And that's a lot of pressure to feel.
Yes. And I'm like, stop, just stop. So one of the things that I love to work through, and this goes for teachers too, they're just kind of like, I have to get this report exactly right and pick exactly the right IEP goals. I'm like, you know what, if you pick IEP goals and they end up not being the best IEP goals, and you go to the parent and you say, listen, I thought this was going to work, but really your child's thriving over here and we'd like to switch it up. That parent they're going to buy you a Starbucks gift card, and they're going to say, thank you so much for knowing my child and adjusting their education. You don't have to get it right. What you have to do is admit when you need to switch. That's the big thing. So same thing with parents, like you don't have to get that meeting perfect. Now, are there some meetings that are extremely pivotal in a child's education? Like we're going to go from a public setting to a private therapeutic day school. Yeah, that's pretty impactful for a student. And it does, create this pivot in their education that's significant. But majority of IEP goals or IEP meetings are not at this crisis level that a child is going to fail at life if we don't get it just right during this meeting.
If you could give one piece of advice to parents and teachers that are entering, and this could be two parts, right? Because we were talking about a lot of this is geared towards parents, but also if we're talking about regular ed teachers, we haven't even had that conversation. They're part of our IEP table. And then special ed teachers that are entering their first IEP meeting. What would that be?
Question everything. I wish I would have had the guts to question everything. You don't have to question everything at the IEP table in front of your peers or in front of the IEP team and that. But if a child has, as a teacher, if you're looking at it, or as a parent who's receiving new IEP goals and that, and you're like, I don't even know, like, why are we working on this? Ask. Why are we working on this? Why is this service being provided this way? Why is this accommodation modification there? You want to fully understand the inner workings of the IEP and how it's executed. Everybody on that IEP team should understand that. And, I get a lot of questions of, I don't know why they're doing this, but this is what it is and I don't like it. And I'll say, did you ask why? Well, no, because they decided. Did you ask them why they decided? No. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to help you go be aggressive at a team because something's not working because they made a decision when I don't know why that decision was made. So if we can figure out the why, then we can work through why it's not working and where to go next and how we can adapt it. But you question everything. I can pull up a piece of paper in a room full of parents. So like I always have parents bring their IEPs to my workshops. I say, this is not something where you're going to take notes and figure it out when you go home. Like we're going to figure it out right now in person, bust it out. Let's look through it. And I'll say, go to the service pages and they'll have listed like, here's your OT, here's your speech, here's your PT, here's your, special education class, resource teacher, self-contained room, whatever it's listed in there. Here's all of these things. And there's always been like, I don't even know why my child's getting social work. Well, then that's a great question to ask the team. I don't know why my child is in 30 minutes of speech. I thought we agreed on 60 minutes of speech. Okay, we need to go say, why did the minutes not reflect the last decision? So learning to question everything, no matter what your team is, that is not an attack. That is not causing conflict. That is causing a common understanding of what needs to happen for this child to receive an appropriate education.
And I think asking why really does transcend to every player, sitting at that table, why are we doing this? And that really goes to best practice in the classroom as well for gen ed teachers and special ed teachers of, understanding the why, I think is a great part. And to couple with that, exactly what you said is, coming together calmly, not attacking, having a conversation, circling around the best interests of this individualized education plan. What are 5 necessary items to bring with you as a parent to an IEP meeting?
Oh, I love that question. I love it. So 5 things that you need to bring. One is, I hope that you wrote that parent input statement and you submitted it before the IEP meeting and you bring a printed copy with you so you can check mark that you went through everything because those are your concerns. If you walk out of the meeting with 80% of that letter addressed, your parent concerns, your parent input addressed, you have absolutely had a successful IEP meeting, even if everything didn't go your way. So you need to bring a copy of whatever you submitted beforehand so your concerns are in writing. You need to bring your favorite latte or tea or water, flavored water, your best water bottle, whatever that is. You need to bring something that is yours to hold with comfort. Bring that Yeti mug with you and just have it with you. So you have to bring that. You should bring somebody to support you. And sometimes I did not go with my clients in person, but what happened is I would be calling or texting with them before the meeting. They would go in and I actually had that time reserved on my calendar. So if they needed to stop the meeting and pause and call me and say, hey, this is happening, that was actually a very affordable way for the parent to have support and know that they weren't there alone. They were there as kind of eyes and ears for their own kid. And then they knew they could have access to a support person. So whether you bring your neighbor to help you take notes or you have somebody on standby so you can pause the meeting, having that third party person is so important. The 4th thing that you need to bring as an open mind. You have got to be ready to collaborate. This is not about perfection. Our system is not set up for perfect education. This is about doing the best that we can at that time with the resources and the data and the information that's available. So you have to prep yourself, I'm just going to say, to suck it up through some of the conversations that are going to be tough, because you know what? It's going to be okay. And then the fifth thing that I want you to bring, and this is really more of, I actually want you to have it on your list to take it home, is that I want you to take home a copy of the IEP within 24 hours. And that is, if you're on Zoom, then you want that meeting, the meeting notes, all the documents and all of those things. So if you're a virtual meeting, you want those things within 24 hours. It is too long, for it to be 2, 3, 4 days. And those finer details, those things that you wanted to look at, they get lost in your mind. And then you start overthinking things, and then you're worried about it. And then a week slips by because you had all these other things. And then the next thing you know, you're calling me because you're like, we had this IEP meeting and I never got a copy of it. And it happened, a month ago. So just have that request ready for, I need a copy of this, either now if you're in person or within 24 hours.
It is fantastic that you put in that you can pause the meeting. I don't know that folks at the table, including the professionals, know that you can actually hit pause and phone a friend. You can 100% do that and just say, hey, I need a second. Just give me a second. I can phone a friend. And I think that's a really incredible piece. And also the open mind as well. I mean, all of the ideas, I love the drink and all of the ideas I think are incredible to have. What organizational tips? As we know that if you have a kiddo and they have been through multiple IEPs, what organizational tips do you have for parents with regards to the materials, the documents, the forms? Do you offer any kind of advice on that?
So there was a time many years ago when we were still definitely all in the paper ages of things. And I had a lot of clients that were local. They would actually say, can I just drop off like literally the banker's boxes, right? That you fold and put together like yourself kind of thing. Can I just drop this off? Can you fix it for me? Like, can you just put it in, organize it in some way? And I always organized it in timeline fashion. Right? So it was just in a chronological, this is what happened. I made sure that the formal evaluations that happen every 3 years, that those were very clearly labeled different because they look different and they can look confusing in that. So kind of having those big evaluations, and if it happened more often than that, then just making sure big evaluations were flagged in this process. And I also recommend splitting your organization into 2 different piles, being that I want everything that is IEP related. Your the worksheets that your child brings home for math that apply to a math goal, I want them in one pile. And the general math worksheet that has nothing to do with your child's IEP goal needs to go someplace else in that other pile with like your child's art project and all of the miscellaneous stuff. So you can have a miscellaneous pile because you keep all of your child stuff, because that's what we do for a while, at least. We keep everything, especially in the special needs community, we keep everything. So have one pile for stuff and have another pile that's all very specific IEP communication, chronological. And you want to be able to look at it and say, I don't know if my child's making progress. That's why we keep this history. I don't know if my child's making progress. I don't know if this is working. You want to be able to go back to those benchmarked big evaluations and make sure there's significant changes, and then make sure that the goals are written really based off of those. So there's a whole process on how you can advocate. If you have it organized like that, it makes it easier and fact-based.
Kind of to piggyback on that, have you seen a teacher use a specifically successful method for keeping IEP documents and caseload information organized? So we talked about the parents. Have you seen anything that like you've gone to a meeting and you're like, wow, that's really helpful?
My first instinct is no. I haven't seen anything that is overwhelmingly awesome. Okay. Now,
that's a fair answer.
That because there's so much going on. That's actually one of the IEP meeting prep strategies that I work with parents and teachers on, is to be very specific of what are you bringing to the table that is important and relevant to this conversation. So like, that's great that you took 75 pages of behavior data in a Google Doc, but what does it mean for the child staying on task? I want to know the meaning of it. I want to know what we're doing with this information. My favorite things that are brought to the table. So whether the teacher chooses Google Docs and Google this and Google that, that's because that's the thing right now, is all the Google stuff. The other one is Canvas. That's another one where they're keeping a lot of work in. So there's all these digital management. It's no different than really us trying to figure out which digital planner to use. And we're so used to paper planners that like we don't know how to get our brain around it. The same thing is happening to teachers right now. But the best thing that a teacher can do when it comes to organization management or communicating with the parent what's happening is bring the tools that you're actually using with the child. I want to see the visuals. I want to see the Velcro stuff. I want to see that, because as a third-party person who has listened in and attended, thousands of IEP meetings, when they say, we have a visual schedule that assists the child in the morning routine. Great. Can I see it? Because my version of a visual schedule may be different than your version of a visual schedule. And mom's trying to visual schedule at home and it's not working. So what are you using that is successful? So for all the professionals that are listening, be proud of the work that you're doing and bring to the table the demonstration of this is what the IEP looks like in the real life. This IEP paperwork is so far out there. It just feels like we wrote this paper and then we get back to the real world. I want to see the connection of the actual materials being used. And that is highly effective in making sure that we are on topic, talking specifically about what this child needs, what they're doing, and what we can do next.
So what are the most important aspects, the IEP teacher, or aspects of the IEP that teachers must know?
So teachers, I'm going to put them right back into the same place as the parent. You have to know how to develop this parent input statement. It's really fun. So when I have teachers who take the Master IEP Coach mentorship, their number one feedback at the end of the mentorship is, I had no idea that I could get so much information from the parent and it could help me make my job easier. So that's why I train everybody in the same room, because that one piece can literally shift a child's education in a huge way. So they need to know that piece. They also need to know specifically what they're accountable for when they walk away from that table. And if they don't know who's going to modify the worksheet, that is the time. You have an entire team sitting there. Like you said, it's like a boardroom. So you've got, anywhere from 7 to 12 people sitting around this table. And you've got details like worksheet will be modified. Say it out loud. Professionals, do not hesitate to say like, okay, we need to do these modified worksheets. How are we going to make this happen?
Yeah,
and no, otherwise you're going to get called out. Yeah. You're going to get called out 3 months from now. They're going to say, how come you weren't doing this? And you're going to say, I had no idea. I thought the resource teacher was doing it.
Yes. Preach. How do we bridge the communication gap between parents and teachers? What should parents do if they don't feel heard by their child's teacher? Who is the next point of contact? All of that. How do we bridge that gap?
So you have to decide what is important for you when it comes to communication points. Meaning there are some parents that need to know literally their child's bathrooming schedule and what is happening at lunchtime. And they need to know more details about the day than maybe another parent who is like, I just want to know, did my child make it through reading class without a meltdown? With that. Then there's other parents that want to know, I want to know what book you're reading in reading class because I'm going to buy it on Amazon and I'm going to read it at home with my child because that's how they like to support their children. There's all different ways to communicate with a family and with an IEP team. And everybody's looking for this like, okay, so let's set up parent and team communication. Once a week, we'll send home. And I'm like, the parent doesn't even probably want half that information. And I say that again from experience. I'll wrap this back around to, I was the typical, and oh my gosh, the parents who are going to hear this, I'm telling you, over half of your teachers in special education are still doing this. If there is a journal of something going back and forth in the backpack or some version of this digitally with this, they are literally taking away from the last 30 minutes, 45 minutes of instruction. And they're saying, okay, I have to write all the parents. I have to do all these things. If I really thought about it, my parents of my students probably didn't want to know half of that stuff that I was telling them, but I felt like it was my job. That's the 1980s version of special education, is that you write these cute little notes and journals and stuff. So just be very upfront, and you should, just as you should say, what are your struggles are at home? And a teacher should be saying, what is most important to you for me to communicate to you? Now, the other way, it's the same thing. It's parents saying to the teachers, like, listen, these are the things that I'm worried about. What's the best way to communicate with you? And set up expectations, because if you're not being heard, then we haven't clarified how you should be communicating, how often, about what, and each form of communication is for a different purpose, whether it's a formal letter, an email, and all that. So we have to get all of that kind of streamlined.
Is there such a thing as over communicating or overstepping when it comes to accommodations?
Overstepping when it comes to accommodations, I do think that there's absolutely, on both everything from creating the IEP that sometimes has given so many accommodations, almost out of habit of like, this is what we needed to do for a child in second grade, so we have to keep doing it. And that comes from a teacher and school side and from a parent side. And a lot of times when a fresh IEP team comes in and they try to switch things up, there's a lot of arguments over that, because the next IEP team's like, well, now the child's in middle school. Let's try this differently. Let's do this differently. Let's build some more independence. And you know what? Growing is hard. Going from crawling to walking, there's a lot of falls that happens for a child. And it's the same thing in the school system. So I absolutely think that there can be too much at times. I do not think that there's any, bad intentions when that happens. I just think that this is why we need ongoing data to make sure that we're helping the child become as independent as possible. And again, it kind of goes back to, as a parent, your child. Sometimes you're going to have to be pushed out of your comfort zone because other people actually see strengths in your child that you may not see because you've been through a lot with them. And I say that as a mom too. There are things like, I just got an email from my child's teacher that was just like, I'm so excited to have your daughter in class. She's been helping me co-host the Zoom, and she's engaging and she's doing all these things. I would have never thought that about my daughter in a history class. Like, I was like, what? Like, I'm on her and stuff of like, are you are you participating in your online classes? And here the teacher just reached out. So be aware that you're each seeing different strengths and weaknesses, and we need to adjust for that.
So at what age or point should the child be the one to kind of initiate the communication on his own or her own behalf? Like, I think it's very individualized on that child. But what have you seen that's worked well?
So that's interesting. I was just having a huge conversation yesterday about self-advocacy and being able to be a self-advocate. We want to encourage all of our students to be a self-advocate. And that can be anything from learning how to ask for help in the classroom because your pencil broke, to a high schooler who needs help figuring out what they're going to do after high school and going through that process. There's such a wide range of help that's in there. So, when is it the right time for a child to start directing their education? It really, of course, it depends on so many different factors, so many different ability levels, their perspective, but they should always be learning self-advocacy skills and developing those at a higher level every year. So if a child makes it kind of to that point by, let's say, sixth grade, that they want to say, you know what, I don't want a reading resource room. I would rather sit in a regular reading class with all of my friends. And you know what, I'll go to homework club after school, but don't take me out of that class. That happens a lot. There's a lot of self-advocacy, being involved in directing your own education in that way. If that's appropriate, that's great. If we're still working through where the adults are going to have to guide the education, but the child is just learning to, again, self-advocate for help and for what they need and what their feelings are about things, that may last all the way through high school, where they're never going to be directing exactly what they're learning, but they are giving input about who they are, what their likes and their dislikes are, what's easy for them, what's hard for them. So they can always give input. I mean, a younger child can give that kind of input also. So all of these things can be input, but the direction really depends on just when do they have that strong enough opinion that basically says, I can't engage in my learning if you don't do what I'm saying because I'm advocating that I need this.
Advocacy is so important. What practices have you found most successful for connecting families and educators in a way that allows them to know they're on the same team?
So that clear communication with expectations defined, that's going to be the best piece between the team to make sure that we're moving in the right direction for the child. That practice of the communication. But there's a second part to that of the best thing that you can do is know that you don't know everything and we are going to have to adjust things. So having that humble mindset of I tried my best, but we can adjust this. And now I have more information so I can do things differently. The best practice is being able to shift and adjust as needed for the child rather than digging your heels in. And that goes for everybody on the team. There's always going to be some sticking point at some point in a child's, kind of education career where somebody's going to dig their heels in and say, this is right or this is wrong. Again, those are situations that are actually far and few between. Most things, there's a compromise and an adjustment and a shift that can happen to move forward.
What differences do you notice at an IEP meeting now that we're in full swing of virtual learning? Have you noticed a difference in terms of conversations that you're having with families, conversations that you're having with educators or other folks in the team that are different from when, now meetings are online versus in person?
So I was doing virtual meetings before virtual meetings were cool. Like way back in the day before Zoom and all the other things. I was attending IEP meetings by phone and I would just support my clients. Again, they would just put me on speakerphone and I would be there. The school would actually got landlines. The landline from the school would call me in and put me on speaker. And those meetings always went different. And my parents, my clients that I would work with, and sometimes schools hired me. I traveled the country doing consulting and then they would have me call in so I could help kind of bridge this gap and come up with solutions with the team. With that, everybody would say like, oh, that meeting went so smoothly because it's like we're on point because they didn't have me in the room for all of the kind of niceties that go with when you're in the room and you're just kind of like, hey, okay, like this is all going to go okay, right? All right. Like did you have a good commute in? Okay, sounds good. Who brought donuts to the table? That was so nice. No, like all of that's done. And so whenever I listened in virtually, it was just like, they were like, oh, somebody's on the phone. We need to move from point A to point B to point, and we need to move through this. That same thing has translated into the masses right now, where you tend to get on the Zoom meeting and you're like, okay, here's the agenda. We're all dialed in right here. And we're just like point A, point B, point C, and we're moving through it. That's actually a huge benefit of what's going on. And we're seeing a little bit more meetings happening, being that we need to touch base a little bit more, but it's for a shorter amount of time because we're not lingering around stuck at an impasse, hashing out the same conversation over and over, and almost like, well, nobody's leaving this room till it's done. The Zoom meetings are scheduled and we can always schedule more. We can always address it in a different way. We can always do that. So I love how the process has been more streamlined. Of course, there are difficulties because you can't always read the room and you're juggling, mom's juggling a lot of things or dad's juggling, there's a lot of other moving pieces, but that's just, we're not in practice. People haven't practiced this enough. They'll get there. I hope that we continue to have virtual meetings. Like, could you imagine like not having to find the childcare, not having to get everybody in the same room at the same time, that a teacher can pop in for 15 minutes and share what she needs to share and not have to sit through a 3-hour meeting? It works.
For sure. There's definitely a lot of benefits to that. And just even on the teaching side, I've seen components where teachers will pop into the Zoom and then run into a little breakout room and be able to have some more really specific, direct, individualized impact with a kiddo. And then they have office hours where the kids can come and ask specific questions. So I think there's definitely an element to that technology component that we have benefited from. Is there a Zoom etiquette or a protocol in terms of meetings? And like you said, you've done this before. You've called in prior to Zoom and Google Meets and, Team and whatever platform a school district is using for their IEP meetings. Have you seen an etiquette or a protocol when it comes to speaking and sharing out in the group at the IEP meeting?
The best etiquette that you can have is a clear agenda before you begin and a plan on how you're going to execute it. So as a team, it is your responsibility to say, this is what's going to happen in these next 60 minutes. And as a team, I mean like parent, teacher, and that. So again, if we go back to that parent input statement that's submitted in a formal way ahead of time, that typically becomes a big part of the agenda. And it's just, it becomes more like, and I'll give an exact example. They would say, thank you, Ms. Taylor, for sending in your parent concerns. We will make sure to address all of these through the meeting. But first, we're going to go over a little bit of the present levels of performance and the goals that we've chosen. And you'll see how those are going to address several of your concerns. And then mom's just like, okay, let's hear it. And
I'm being heard. That's right. You've diffused a bunch of stuff because it's like, I'm being heard as a parent.
Absolutely. And then you're not sitting at the Zoom meeting, like writing down furiously, like, are they going to address this? Are they going to, right? You're taking notes for yourself. Like, are they going to talk about this? And they can't forget about this. And how about this? Set the expectation. So tell them what you're going to talk about, then talk about it, then recap what you've talked about. That's meeting etiquette. So everybody has clear expectations, you execute them, and then you recap what happened.
Well, and I think that's meeting etiquette on and offline for sure. 100%.
It should be, but that etiquette is easier on Zoom than it is in person because it's just more comfortable for many people. And even if you're uncomfortable, you tend to fall into the rhythm of a Zoom a little bit easier than watching maybe what's happening at the table or side conversations or such.
Love it. I love it. You have so much information and insight to really make this process seem less overwhelming for parents, more streamlined, hopefully, for educators or other service providers that are part of this IEP process. I did reference teachers a bunch, and not to leave out our fantastic service providers or OT or speech or PT in terms of their input at the IEP table and what they have to offer for sure. So as we kind of wind down our conversation today, is there something that I did not ask that I should have asked?
I'm going to wrap back around to how I typically start a conversation about IEPs, and that's making sure that our conversations are rooted in the purpose and findings of IDEA law. And there's 3 parts to this purpose and findings. There's a lot of parts, but there's 3 parts that I like to focus on. And I want everybody to remember that this is the purpose of why we are at the IEP table. When I ask parents or teachers, why do we even have IEPs? It's kind of a trick question because I know that they're going to say things like, well, to help kids keep up with other kids, or to make sure that they're learning at school, or to make sure that they get some speech therapy. And it's so much more than that. So the purpose and findings of IDEA law, most people know the first part where it says every child gets a free and appropriate public education. But it also follows by saying to meet a child's unique needs. So I want parents to understand that your child's unique needs absolutely have to be addressed in the school system from an educational standpoint. And it's also to prepare a child for further education, employment, and independent living. So for anybody who has heard, we can't do that, we don't address that, that's not a school issue. If it does fall into further education, employment, or independent living, it's a skill that would impact those areas, and your child qualifies for an IEP, you absolutely can have the conversation and get results in having those areas addressed as a whole child.
If we had a billboard and you had one piece of advice to take away, to put on this billboard that folks would see as they're driving down the highway, what would that be?
So I kind of have a billboard on my website right now that's catching a lot of traction because I've been pretty bold in saying it, is that it's time to leave the 1980s version of special education behind. And that's for everybody. That we can talk about all of these things, all of these strategies, all of these different hopes and dreams and, practices that we can enact. But so often we revert right back to what's been happening, 30 years ago. We're going back to the old school IEP goals. We go back to blaming the system. We go back to saying we can't do this. We go back to saying special education has to be a fight all the time. We go to, back to that angry version of advocacy. Everything slides backwards. So we talk in this hopefulness of opportunity and we talk about these strategies and then teams go back to this 1980s version. So if I could just say stop this old school version of special education, you have the skills as parents, teachers, admins, and therapists to change the future of special education. You don't need the law to change. You don't need, $1 million in your district to make it happen. You don't need lobbying and anger in a way that's unproductive. What you do need is the determination to say, we're not going to do it like we did in the past because our children deserve better and we can make this happen together.
So our tagline for Learning Essentials is educate, experience, and empower. And I feel certain that our conversation today has hopefully done those things for anyone that's listening, regardless of what part of their journey they are in with their kiddo, where they sit at the table. But certainly if you're at an IEP table, you belong there to have your voice heard as it relates to a kiddo. And so I cannot thank you enough. It's been incredible to have this conversation with you, to empower folks that are listening. I will put in the show notes that you do offer courses to become a master IEP coach for parents, for educators, so that they can then continue to feel empowered, to feel educated, so that they can be that voice to kind of end that 1980s IEP and to truly support our kiddos. So phenomenal. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for what's to come in special education. And I just thank you for having me as a piece of this conversation to help move things forward.
Thank you for joining us today for our IEP Essentials Pro Tips podcast. To hear more pro tips and find additional IEP Essentials, including our IEP webinar, please visit www.learningessentialsedu.com.